a conversation between Nathan Langston, Kobus Marais, and Carolyn Shread. Just very quickly, Nathan Langston is our very, very special guest, an artist whose project called Telephone is, I think, going to be the central aspect of today's conversation. I'm just going to put the link to his project up in the chat area so that anybody who's interested and isn't 100% familiar with the project can actually click and have a quick look at the premises and the way that the project has been put together. In the meantime, very, very quickly, Kobus Marais, for those who aren't familiar with him, is Professor of Translation Studies in the Department of Linguistics and Language Practice at the University of the Free State, Bloemfontein in South Africa. He's published 2 monographs, namely Translation Theory and Development Studies, a complexity theory approach, and a biosemiotic theory of translation, the emergence of sociocultural reality. He's also published 2 edited volumes, one with Ilse Feunauer, Translation Studies Beyond the Post-Colony, and one with Rainer Meilert's Complexity Thinking in Translation Studies, Methodological Considerations. His research interests include translation theory, complexity thinking, semiotics and biosemiotics, and development studies. Carolyn Shread, who needs no introduction, is senior lecturer in French at Mount Holyoke College and teaches translation at Smith College in the United States. She has translated over 10 books, mostly scholarly and literary texts, and published numerous articles in the field of translation studies. Her articles address the intersection of translation and plasticity, Malibu's signature concept, as well as introducing Bracker-Ettinger's psychoanalytic concept of metamorphosis in order to rethink translational paradigms with a feminist lens. She has a long-standing interest in feminist translation and decolonial translation practices and has written several articles on translating Haitian author Marie Vieux-Chauvet's Les Rapaces. Her recent translations include 5 books by contemporary French philosopher Catherine Malabou and a blog post by Achille Mbembe on the universal right to breathe for critical inquiry. She's currently translating Catherine Malabou's Le Plaisir Effacé, Clitoris et Pensée, which should be coming out, I presume, shortly. Thank you, Nathan, Kobus, and Carolyn.
Okay, I think, Salvatore, thanks so much for that introduction. It's really wonderful to be here with my co-panelists and with everybody else who's on this call. The title that we gave to this conversation is Playing Telephone, Semiotics and Translation Plasticity in a Global Arts Game. And the playing and the game come from Nathan. Thank you, Nathan, for bringing into translation that has been overly weighed down by its tasks and its labor and its work, a kind of joyful playfulness that may be part of this re-envisioning. I think that that's part of your signature. I just wanted to say a few words about how this panel came together. So Telephone, as you will be able to learn about shortly, is presented on the website as a whispered global arts game. So it was whispered to me. A colleague at Smith College told me she had heard a whisper from another colleague who, and both of them were involved in this game. And they said, maybe you should include in this Art of Translation lecture series that I've been running for 9 years now, Nathan Langston, and that maybe he would come and talk to us about Telephone. He did that, and it was a really wonderful and absolutely apt and contemporary way to frame translation. The way he was thinking about translation resonated with students who, in previous iterations of this lecture series, which started off as a literary translation, very focused towards the literary world, they really got what Telephone was doing. And that framed the way that this class, which is a really introduction to translation, answered the students' understanding of translation. When Nathan was going to come and talk to us, along with 3 other people, a student and 2 colleagues from Smith who had been part of that game, I wrote to Kobus Marais because we were on Zoom at this point where we were in the middle of the pandemic. And they did have the advantage that I could say, hey, I think you might be interested in what we're going to be doing, and maybe you'd like to come. Kobus wrote back to me in a sentence that I think is really important. I hope you don't mind me quoting your email, Kobus. He says, I cannot remember when last I was so excited about something. That was a really exciting statement. And I think that has generated long discussions back and forth. This is to interlocutors here. But I also wanted to really give credit to Siri Nergard for her insistence and her commitment and dedication to conversation, dialogue, interviews. If we look back through the journal translation, Siri has always been there in dialogue. She's always wanted to have that dialogic process be at the center of moving translation forward. I think that's really important as we think about how this Advanced Research Center, both its origins, because I think the reason people have stayed with this group and are always including new people is that it's a place where people can come together and talk. As we're talking about that, what's interesting is that when new people come in, we get new perspectives. And Kobus and I both shared with Nathan some of our work in translation studies. And I just wanted to throw this out there when after hearing Brian Baer and Michelle Woods talking about the myth history of translation, Nathan's comment was partly not about what we were saying, but about the tone. It was like, why are you guys so defensive? What's going on here? What is this polemic? Why do you have to talk like this? That's a really good question for translation studies to answer. And I think it does. I think Brian has started to answer that, because if there is only one history, that history is going to try and assert itself and impose itself through a particular style and through a particular clearing of previous voices, and a kind of trying to find yourself a space. So I think it's sort of suitable that we are both meeting here on Zoom, and that maybe we can move from a task into a game, and maybe we can move from an adversarial voice into one which really actually gets to the pleasure of what we've been doing. We know that what we like to do is come together and talk. But when we write, sometimes we tend to need to clear some space. So that was just me wanting to frame a little bit who we are, why we're talking here. I think we had agreed that we should start by having Nathan really define what this telephone thing is, show everybody what it is a little bit, and then we'll move on to Kobus talking about why it is that when he heard Nathan doing this and he heard about this game, why he found that so tremendously exciting and productive for his own thinking about translation.
It made me so happy. And I think that there's a lot of connection between this conversation and the one that we just heard. So yeah, I'm Nathan. I'm not a translator, at least by trade. And I wanted to share this game with you. It's called Telephone. The link is in the chat. But yeah, basically when everything shut down in the States last March, my artist friends and I were really struggling with how to respond, what to do. And so we decided to play a game of telephone. And I can bring that up right here. Can everyone see it? Okay, great. So yeah, this is just like the children's game of telephone, which is played ubiquitously everywhere in the world. Pretty much everywhere in the world. It's called Telefono Descompuesto, it's called Steel Post, it's called Dengon, it's called Telefono Roto, Telefon Shavur. I mean, it's the children's game in which you whisper a message from person to person, and the message evolves as it is passed from person to person. As far as I can tell, this game is at least as old as the 1700s. But it's probably much older than that, and nobody bothered to write it down because the rules are so simple. We put a couple of twists on the game. The first one is that rather than just whispering a message from person to person, from ear to ear, we whispered it from art form to art form. So a message could become a poem and then was translated into poetry, or it was into painting, and then into dance, and then into music, and then into film. And you could watch the message evolve and the information evolve as it moved through all of those various art forms. The second, well, I'll get to that in a moment. You can see here, this is our original message. It is by a British ecologist named Dr. Mike Shanahan. And yeah, it's about a banyan tree. It's about how Alexander the Great's army, they were probably the first Europeans to ever see a banyan tree. And they were blown away by it. And they sent back reports to Greece, and it helped inform the field of botany and the beginning of botany. You can see that one twist that we did is that instead of just whispering it from one artist to another artist, we whispered it to multiple folk. So you can see we whispered it. In this case, the first message went out to 6 different artists, and each one of them did a translation of that into their own form. And it just keeps moving along, and you can kind of choose your own path, your own adventure through it, and kind of see how it moves and how it changes over time, and look for resonances and etc. As it moves through. You can see the number of artists. There were almost 1,000 artists that played this, and it just keeps going. And you can also see where they played on Earth. So, you know, you can zoom into New York or whatever and like see all of the artists that played there. You can filter it by various things if you only want to see where the musicians are on Earth. You can also look at the actual game structure itself. So here we have the game map. I can zoom out and you can see how vast it is. There were about 14 different generations from the original message all the way to the final message. You can also see the shape of it. So here, things were growing exponentially in the first half of the game. And then when we got to the second half of the game, the 6th round is about 270 or so works of art. And each one of these you can click into to actually see the work itself. But then we flipped the process. So we started assigning 2 or 3 works of art to a single artist and saying, what do these have in common? They did come from the same place. They may seem very different to you, but your job now is to try to synthesize those works together. And so then you start getting exponentially smaller and smaller in scale as it goes down. So you begin with a single original message, and you end with a single work of music from Hong Kong. The game itself, it was 409 artists from 493 cities in 72 countries. We passed the message about 7.6 million kilometers. And it took a year, almost exactly a year and a week to play it from beginning to end. And the thing is that we built this, I watched it come together, but it will take much smarter people than myself to figure out what is actually happening in it. Because there were a lot of things that happened throughout the course of the game that were mysterious and difficult to explain. So that is the game of telephone. If you go to the About page, you can learn more about it. We also have essays by a number of scholars, both internationally and in the States. So there you go. And when I got that message from Carolyn about what Kobus said after the lecture I gave at Smith College, I was just over the moon. I was just so excited. And so everyone on this, watching this panel, is catching us basically mid-conversation as we continue to wrestle with some of the implications of this game and what it means to translate from one form to another. So I'll pass it over to Kobus for sure.
Nathan, thanks. Can you maybe just share? Thanks a lot. So thank you very much, Carolyn and Nathan, for playing with me and for allowing me to play with you. I feel honored to be in also part of this inaugural webinar, playing with really established scholars. So thanks for that. So let me try and explain to you why I was so excited. I think there are obviously many reasons. It's just conceptually amazing. There's a lot of work that went into this. It's a lot of fun. It's interesting. But for me, it immediately demonstrated basically all of the theoretical arguments that I was trying to make. Sorry. And what I'm going to try to do today is, in the 12 or 15 minutes, is just to show you through the game the theory that I think that lies behind it. So I'm going to try and talk about 4 or 5 theoretical points, if you want to call it that. And I'm going to present them a bit simplistic just for the sake of the argument. They're obviously more complex than I will present them, but I don't have time for a very nuanced argument. So the first point I think that Nathan's game demonstrate is that translation is semiotic in the first place, not linguistic. Now let me show you what I mean. So this is their first, oops, I just need to get it. Yes. So this is the source text. This is the mother of all source texts, if you want to call it that, right? And according to traditional translation studies, this is what a source text should look like. It should be written text in a natural language, and it should be translated into another language. But let's just see what happens with this text. The written linguistic text gets translated into a work of artwork, in colors, in shapes, in texture. And you could still argue, well, we know about this because we know about things like ekphrases and interart and all these kinds of things where written language or spoken language are translated into arts. But Nathan's game demonstrates more than this, because when you look at the next generation, and by the way, the other thing that Nathan's work do is to put translations in historical lineage. So he talks about earlier generations, siblings, and later generations. In my theoretical work, I've spoken about incipient and subsequent signs, which is basically the same thing, that there's a historical dimension to this. But that aside, so if you look at the translation of this artwork, sure, there is another literary text that it can be translated into. But there's also some music. So the question is, can you hear the music on your side? Right. So just a very short piece. So the point is that translations can take place between any semiotic material. Language does not have to mediate in this. So I think this is the first point that Nathan's game really makes clear for us. The second point, I think, which is demonstrated just by this map itself, is that translation has infinite sources and infinite targets. So the typical thinking that there is a source text and a target text in the translation process is really shown to be faulty here. Because, let me just make it a bit bigger. So if I were to choose this translation, this target text, this target text has a lineage back, if you can follow my cursor, back, back, back here, and back to Nathan's source text, which wasn't in itself a source text because he got it from somewhere, somebody else wrote it. He translated it by putting it into his game, and it was the interpretation of somebody else. So I think what the map itself demonstrates to us is that there's a complex array of incipient and subsequent streams of meaning. So somehow the translation here has not only been influenced by its source, but by the whole lineage and probably other lineages too. I mean, this is still quite linear. So if you want to talk rhizomatic, there's probably much more to be seen here. And if you look on the other half of the map, then you see that this text was the source text for that one, and 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 the final one, if you want to take its lineage, right? So I think that's a second point which the game really very nicely illustrates, is that meaning is a never-ending stream. Meaning is like stream of consciousness. It's like the flow of your body, the flow of your brain. It doesn't stop, and it's a mix of streams. Right. The next point that I want to illustrate, just want to get here. Right. So I think in some of my previous work, I've tried to conceptualize translation as work that is performed to constrain some semiotic material under the auspices of some kind of pragmatic intention, goal, whatever. So the map and the way in which translations occur here clearly shows this kind of work at play, although it raises questions about the nature of the work. And I'll show you in a moment what I mean by that. So if you look at this, just assume, if you've seen a banyan tree before, with its massive aerial roots, so it looks like a little forest. So here I can see the source text in this artwork, right? If you go to the painting that follows on this, the question now becomes, what kind of work has been put in here? What resources did this artist have available to be able to translate something of the previous source or the previous semiotic, the previous sign? Now, you could still here say, okay, well, the colors are totally different, right? So it's not a translation of color. But we don't know. We just don't have language at this point to describe, like we can describe the sort of the differences between languages. We can map sentences syntactically onto one another. We can map words semantically onto one another, and we can work out something in this and say, how can we map these two languages onto one another? We don't have the conceptual tools in the language to explain yet how these works of art map onto one another. Well, I could, with my limited art knowledge, say, well, I see the same kind of liney structure here. Maybe that's what that was what was translated, and some of it was changed. But why was it changed? We just don't know. But oh, sorry. In a what happened here? So some artists took the previous sign, interpreted it, found something in there that was translatable into music and translated it. I haven't got a clue what that is. And I think this is why this game is so wonderful, that this will now allow a systematic study of what is it that musicians translate from visuals, and how do they do it? We can now start, obviously, in a transdisciplinary or a multidisciplinary way, start talking to one another about these kinds of processes. The data, I think, also, sorry, I just want to use this very same, no. Where is the one that I had just now? This one. I think, and I know it's a dangerous claim to make, but I think this game shows that there's no untranslatability. Any sign can be translated. I think it questions the idea of untranslatability, and it shows how untranslatability sort of you have to make a number of assumptions to argue for untranslatability, which this kind of work, I think, calls into question. I mean, I think this kind of work makes us ask questions like, what does green sound like? What does tough tastes like? What does a straight line smell like? So these kind of really absurd questions become real questions when you look at this kind of data, because as I've shown you now, this work of art is translated into a piece of music, which means somehow anything must be translatable into anything else. It's not copyable, but it's translatable. And this data, and I'm just going to use this we'll go through this quickly to finish in time. This data also shows us the problem of what do we translate? So if you say this was the source text and this was the target text, what was translated? Well, clearly it was not the matter that was translated, because the material, the chemicals in the second, the target text, subsequent sign is not the same materials as in the first one. So it cannot be the materiality that is being translated. Well, you could say it's form, but what is form? If you want to say what is the form that's being translated? How do you get to the form? And these are questions which I'm not sure that I even have answers to. What I would like to suggest is, rather than we're looking for form or for matter, is that we're looking to, that we try and see translation as in terms of constraints, that we say, well, the initial text operated under a certain set of constraints, and a certain set of constraints worked on it and created a pattern of constraints, a pattern, maybe a form, if you want to call it that, and that it was something from that set of constraints that was translated into the subsequent text. It seems to me that, and I don't think we can ever have a quick answer, or for long have a quick answer to this problem. It seems like we have a kind of interpretant based on the patterns of constraints, and then we have another representative based on the patterns of constraints in the interpretant, a kind of a cyclical process in Persian terms. I want to close by sort of asking the question, so what for the future? What did this inspire? Apart from, I'm feeling that some of the theoretical ideas I and other people have been proven by this data. I think there are at least two things that we can explore further. The one is to include more senses. In other words, bake me a cake from this, a cake that tastes like this banyan tree, right? So that I can taste it. Cook me some food that smells like this banyan tree, right? So I think in a further game, we could expand to other senses. And the thing that I want to do, and I'm trying to still get Nathan to help me with this, is to play this game between different academic disciplines. So if I give this to a mathematician and I say to him, translate this for me into maths. And I take that and I give it to a theologian and I say, translate this to me into a confession. And I take that and I give it to a businessman and I say, translate this for me into economics. And I take that to a physicist and I say, translate this for me into physical theory. I'm not exactly sure how to do this yet. There's a lot of conceptualization, but this is sort of what I would like to do. Well, apart from writing academic stuff about this, but I think there are further games to be played. Sorry, I went a bit over my time. I'm done.
That's great. Thank you both, Kobus and Nathan, so much. And it is really seeing the potentiality of this game for really helping us to go where I think we have wanted to go in translation studies. I do think of Nathan as a translation activator. He thinks of himself as an artist, but I think he has activated a very extensive form of translation. I'm just going to speak, in our title, we do have the word translation plasticity. I'm just going to throw this out there. This is, for me, something that comes out of my own practice, working with French philosopher Catherine Malabou. And it's just really another tool maybe at our disposal for thinking through some of the insights that we might get from this. So let's see, sorry. I wanted to share a screen. There we are. And here it is. Okay, great. All right. And as you can see, I only have 3 slides here, which is perfect, just because I'm just going to take a moment to say this. So as I said, I have taken this term plasticity from Catherine Malibu. She has written many books on this. As I was translating them, this term seemed to me to describe what I was doing and to be helpful for debates in translation studies. And I'm just going to here give an insight. She takes plasticity from two pretty different sources, thinking about Kobus's interest in going across the disciplines. First of all, she's taking it from with advances in the sciences, and specifically in neuroscience, and specifically in the idea of neuroplasticity. So that is where she is working. And for her, plasticity is interesting because it covers all simultaneously the idea of bestowing form, giving form to something, receiving form, and also, because of the French term, which she's writing in French, plasticage, exploding form. So she sees form as coming in these different ways. I was very interested in Kobus's, when he was closing up, wondering what it is that is translated and whether it's matter, whether it's form, whether it is constraints, whether form is a reflection of constraints. When I began thinking about translation plasticity, it just seemed to me a useful way to get out of the straitjacket of that negotiation of an original and a secondary text with the hierarchies there. It makes translation into something which is more generative, regenerative in the sense of healing, perhaps, as a force inherent in the transferal of meaning through changes in form. So that is literally all I have in my PowerPoint that I wanted to share. What I will say that one thing that's important to say is that plasticity is not flexibility. Flexibility would be a sort of yielding and an endless adaptability to, for instance, the constraints of capitalism, even as I was speaking to you just, well, no. Whereas plasticity has an element of resistance built into it. And that's important for Malibu in terms of thinking through the political side of this as well. So I think that thinking about plasticity allows for a space of autonomy and resistance. I'm now going to admit to both Nathan and Kobus something that I haven't actually said yet, which is that my investment, I think, in this exploration of multimodal and intersemiotic translation actually comes from my commitment and interest in linguistic translation. And that is exactly where I will end up back again after this foray. And so I think I wanted to just close up my part now by asking Kobus, what do you think that this expansion of translation obviously will have an impact on our, by acknowledging the linguistic bias that is built into the history of translation studies, by expanding that, and will also help us re-envision linguistic translation. So without taking you back to the place that you're trying to escape and go beyond, Kobus, I wonder if you've thought a little bit on those terms about this.
Yes, so probably I just wanted to amend and not really escape, because I think it would be impossible to escape, because language is so foundational in our being. I think, to quickly answer probably two things. The first is that the social semiotics or multimodality movement, if you want to call it that, has very strong links to linguistics in any way through Hallidayan linguistics. Gunter Kress, who was the major social semiotics guy, was a PhD student of Michael Halliday. And Halliday actually also said that language is semiotic. And I think that's correct. Language is just is one of the features or is a semiotic phenomenon, right? And language itself is material in that I speak its energy in the sound waves. It is muscles that have to perform work. Even if I put it on a piece of paper, it is ink that has to be structured in a certain way and constrained in a certain way in certain fonts, and so on. So I think there's a I mean, for instance, in translation studies, people like Douglas Robinson with his ideas about embodied hermeneutics, embodied understanding, as already going a long way towards this kind of thinking. I just think the other thing is that it will help. What I think it will help us is better to understand, let's call it, the recent influences of technology on our communication, which since the 1980s has proliferated visual material. And as I think told you yesterday, we had a very vicious case in South Africa about a year and a bit ago, where a pharmaceutical company wanted to advertise hair products, and they wanted to contrast bad hair with good hair. And it was wonderfully written out. The language was fine. But in the artwork, somebody used black women with the bad hair and white women with the good hair. And that thing blew up enormously. So even at the level of ideology, at the level of power of politics, I think our communication has become so multimodal at this point. I mean, you can even go to movies. I don't know in South Africa, but I've heard of it, where when the character drives over corrugated land, your chair will vibrate. For instance, you get in Japan, you have people who research the kind of smells that they can put into the upholstery of a car, so that people like the car, right? So these are all translations and artificialities that modern technology brings us. And I think that's why it's needed to just expand.
Well, in terms of what you were saying about untranslatability, I mean, I fully buy that. Partly because all meaning does, in some way or another, come back to the brain. I have something in my mind, in my brain, I want to get into your brain. And so I'm going to use all sorts of cognitive pathways. I'm going to use all sorts of like sensory expression, anything that I can to try to get that into your brain, so that we're actually sharing something, so that we've had like a common experience. When you're talking about bake me a cake that tastes like a banyan tree, or when you were saying, what does a straight line smell like? That actually is something that happens in the brain, that people have synesthesia. And people that have synesthesia, there are more than 80 types of synesthesia, of sense to cognition type of synesthesia. So people can smell shapes. People can taste colors. It's maybe like 4% of the population, and a lot of people don't know that they have it, but it exists. And I think that it is just a more extreme example of how people without synesthesia deal with these things. And in terms of bake me a cake, we were going to do, the original idea was that the last piece in the game would be a meal, that we would get a chef and we would give them 2 or 3 different works of art and say, all right, turn this into a meal, and then we're going to all eat the game, right? That was the idea. It was hard to share. It's hard to share a meal on the internet. So, but we were definitely thinking in that direction. And then Carolyn, in terms of the plasticity that you were talking about, when you were talking about the origination and the receiving and then the explosion, we saw all of those things happening as people played this game. Some people wanted to blow it up. I mean, that's what I did when I was a kid playing telephone. I just turned it into something crazy, right? But all of those phases, you know, people experienced, and each one of the artworks in the game, there is a section where the artists subjectively describe what it was like to actually try to do that translation. So we have a bunch of like subjective information as well. Anyhow, it's just, yeah, fascinating to hear you guys wrestle with this.
Hi, everyone. As you can see, I've just appeared, which means that it's almost time for questions. I know that there are a couple of rather lengthy questions that are in arrival. I've just got the one question, if I can just allow myself to ask a question. I know I shouldn't, but perhaps in this particular case, I really was fascinated by the entire conversation between the three of you. One thing that, though, I think was probably ignored in the entire process was the concept of meaning and interpretation. In other words, when there is a message, a text of whatever sort, whether it's a natural language or whether it's a so-called non-natural language, a cake, a statue, a piece of music or whatever, in order for that to be translated further on, there has to be an act of interpretation, of extraction of meaning, if in no other way than purely personally, before moving on to what it is that the reading subject actually wants to then reconstruct in terms of translation. And I think that perhaps that wasn't touched on necessarily. What are your thoughts regarding the interpretative act of the object that is taken as the source text, whatever it be? I don't know who'd like to go first.
I'll
Nathan,
jump in first,
Carolyn,
and then
Kobus.
someone else can save me.
Okay.
There are different kinds of that sort of interpretation that take place. It seemed like when we were watching these artists do it, there is a personal one where you're making associations that nobody else can necessarily share. So they're like a certain subset of interpretations, which you don't know my family, or you don't know the beach that I go to in the summer. You don't know certain aspects of my, you know, my experience. And so those are like personal ones. But there are also like, there are some a priori ones. There are some like, you know, you're getting into like, when you're thinking about how information is passed, you're thinking in terms of rhythm. You know, that's something that we all share in our brain. We all share in our brain. We share volume, we share color, we share the tempo. We, you know, all of these different things that our brains that we all share in terms of both cognition and in terms of like sensory information. Those are all conduits for sending information in an accurate way. And what we found out from this game is that oftentimes abstract works, like really weird looking paintings or really strange music that almost doesn't even sound like music, you could give something very literal and specific, like a piece of prose or a photograph, to one of these very abstract works, and then have that abstract work turned into something that is, again, very literal and figurative. And oftentimes it was so accurate in terms of what came through that it freaked us out. And we didn't know how the abstract work was conveying information at that fidelity so specifically. And it's just something that even art critics and people that study art and really know how to talk about art, there just isn't the vernacular yet to understand how the information is moving through forms and how that translation process is actually working.
So Salvatore, I think it's a really important question. I went over it probably a bit too quickly, but what I tried to say when I spoke about what do we translate, I tried to say we translate and interpretant. So we have in front of us a representative referring to an object. We create an interpretant, and that interpretant is based on inferences of a number of things. It's based on inferences concerning the representative, in other words, the sign that we are seeing. So the patterns of constraints there play a role in what we interpret. The nature of the object and what we know about the object play a role. But then also our context. That's why I try to bring in the notion of pragmatics. So interpretation or hermeneutics is always pragmatically determined by the interest and the context of the person interpreting, and Nathan just gave a number of very good examples for that. So I think it is, I mean, what I'm trying to present, and I think what Nathan's data clearly shows is, yes, translation is a hermeneutic process, translational processes of linking signs to other signs and interpreting them and recreating them and doing with them what you can do with them and what you want to do with them. So that you have the material constraints all the time that with cake you can only do this. But do you want to have cake, or do you want to have steak or something else? You know, so it's sort of those kind of interests that play a role.
Okay, here's Juliana with some other questions.
Yes. So there are a few questions. So the first one is by Christy Merrill. And she says, another nerdy question. I'm wondering about the aerial propagating habits of the tree, which you can see from the Sanskrit name, and how that relates to Siri's earlier point about the rhizomatic ways of understanding the history of translation studies, and if that might help complicate the metaphorics of human propagation built into the underlying network structure, i.e. last generation, siblings, and next generation. Might the real metaphor of banyan tree propagation offer a different way of understanding network theory?
100%. Go for it, Carolyn.
Yeah, I'm really, thank you, Christy, so much for bringing us back to the tree. That's really, we spent a little bit of time talking about the banyan tree actually yesterday with Nathan and Kobus. It turns out that Kobus is really interested in bonsai. Oh, are you gonna share the tree, Nathan?
This is a banyan tree. This is actually Kabir's tree, which Alexander's men might have stayed under. It's thousands and thousands of years old and like 10 or 15 acres wide. Anyway, go ahead.
Can you tell us about the painting on them? Do you know what
it's mostly a protective. It's a protective measure for certain ones. Right. They're just, yeah, they're taking care of the tree.
So thanks for drawing our attention, Christy, to the anthropomorphic. We always tend to come back to ourselves in this way, and even when we are talking about other species living on Earth. So I think that's a really useful reminder of that. But Kobus told us yesterday that he is interested in bonsai, and I wonder whether we can put in relation the bonsai practice and the notion of constraint, and then the aerial propagation of the banyan tree. And I did too notice when Siri mentioned the rhizome that immediately started, I made that connection, so.
I got my constraints, well, it becomes a matter of translation. So I won't deny that one of the source streams of meaning might have been my interest in bonsai and constraint. But for my translation thinking, I'm not aware that I got it there. It might have had an influence, but I'm not aware. I got it from Terence Deacon, who is trying to provide a unified theory of everything. if you can call it that. And he uses sort of thermodynamics as the basis, that the whole of reality is subject to this tendency towards equilibrium. And the only way that things don't die, or things don't go into equilibrium and things don't go formless, is to perform work on them. And work means constraining the energy in a system, and using the differentials. Once you've constrained, you have different levels of energy, like the air inside a pump and the air inside your tire. So you have to create a differential before you can use that energy. So energy is not something, it's a differential, or a relation between two systems. And I've got my ideas about constraints from him, and that is why I'm thinking that what we are translating are relationships or constraints between what we observe. Yeah, so that's sort of, obviously some of this needs to be worked out in a bit more detail, and it's a very long process, because this is complicated stuff which I don't know I understand all the time, but that's where I got it. Sorry, yeah.
Well, in terms of why we picked the banyan tree, one is because it is related to death, because it actually kills its host tree, and we were starting this game and building this tree at the beginning of COVID. And then the other is that when you look at a banyan tree from far away, it looks like a forest of thousands and thousands and thousands of trees, but it's just one tree. It's just, it's all connected, this entire forest of things. And I think that was something that a point that we were trying to make as well.
Can I just build on that a little bit? I wanted to read one sentence from an article by Kobus and have a question for Nathan about this. Kobus, you wrote that translation is thus semiotic work done with the aim of keeping semiosis in a state at the edge of chaos. And I like that term, the edge of chaos. And so I was wondering, Nathan, did you feel with the game, did it feel like it was the edge of chaos? Or did it feel like it was not that, because the game had rules that were, I guess, defining the structure?
Both. Yeah, it was both chaotic and ordered. In a lot of cases, you can go through 10, 11, 12 iterations of these artistic translations and find examples that are staggeringly about a banyan tree. It's clear. It's just absolutely obvious, and it has passed through some very strange translations on the way. The other thing is that we, as artists, we celebrate the weird translations. And this goes to plasticity, and your work is like I think like in genetics, for example, without mistranslation of certain genetic material, the point is to try to be as accurate as possible, but without mutation, without quote unquote mistranslation, which is like a dirty word, I guess, you would not have adaptation. You would not have a continued growth. You would not have like this sustained life. So for us, when it did get chaotic, which it definitely did, there are some weird branches of this tree. We celebrated it. I mean, for us, it was just beautiful and strange and mysterious.
So there is a question referring back to the concept of constraints, and the question is specifically for Kobus, and is by Cristiano Mazzei, who says, does thinking about translation in terms of constraints and not the binary matter, meaning and form add a negative connotation to the work of translation due to its association to limitations? Can we think about constraints differently? If so, how? Can Carolyn's argument of using plasticity regeneration help in the sense that it could blow up the idea of constraints?
the short answer is yes. So this is a real problem because it goes totally counter our intuition. We think of art as freeing up, as of getting rid of constraints, right? So we think of creativity as limiting the constraints of the past to be able to make something new. And I think that is why, Cristiano, why you think it has negative connotations, because let's say in Western philosophical thinking, constraints has negative implications. But if you think in terms of thermodynamics, it cannot be differently. Even creativity is the application of constraints on previous constraints to create something else from what there was. But I mean, just think about a world without constraints. Human cells without constraints is cancer, right? A banyan tree without constraints would be suffocating. I mean, it's killing around it anyway. So as counterintuitive as this seems, and I really battle with the counterintuitiveness of this, but the creativity is the imposition of different constraints on existing constraints. So it's a translation. You take the sign, let's say you have in your mind a style of painting, let's say cubism or whatever, and you take that is a set of constraints that are operative on the shapes and the paint colors and the brush strokes and everything of the artist. If you want to change that, you cannot have fewer constraints. You just have other constraints. You just choose not to use these constraints or to adapt these constraints with other constraints. But if there are no constraints, then artwork covers the whole world, and then it's not artwork anymore.
Like a game without any rules.
Yes.
That would be a funny game to watch.
Charles Peirce said this, for me, wonderful thing. He says, the universe has but one habit, and that is the habit of taking habit. So this is what happens through the second law of thermodynamics. It creates tendencies. It creates habits, if you want to call it patterns, I think. And I totally agree that this has to be worked out in much more detail. For myself, I'm just starting to think about this in terms of translation and culture and society and so on.
Yeah, in this regard, there is a comment by Siri, and she says, regarding constraints in art, Queneau and Perec are excellent examples of constraints that stimulates creativity. That's what Siri, that's the comment. And there are other two questions where there is a question by Antonia Carolyn and then a final comment by Siri. And Antonia Carolyn asks, but isn't what these artists translate the form and not the meaning? Sure, science can be translated, but meaning remains untranslated, even from the first to the second piece. Sorry if I make you jump from one place of your topic to another.
No. I think it's a really fair question, and a question to which I don't have a full answer yet, and I'm not sure whether we will have a full answer. I think it all depends on, or it not all depends. It also depends, and amongst other things, depends on how you understand form and meaning. So for me, meaning is the implication to a living organism of form, right? So I observe as a living organism, I observe form. The implication for me, this is an enemy I should run. The implication for me, this is cake, I should eat. The implication for me. So that can be translated by replicating or repeating or approaching, because replicating is probably a very bad word, sorry, delete. But by approaching a similar set of constraints, I could create something of a similar significance for you with a different sign. So, but it depends on, I mean, so you have zillions of theories of what meaning is. I'm thinking Persian semiotics and whether that is right or wrong, but you don't translate, maybe you think of it, you don't translate anything, you translate relations. What you translate is relations between the material in front of you, the object or the form to which it refers, and the significance for your context. You relate these things together and you make decisions based on that. And as Nathan said, that's somewhere in the cognition, which we still know very little about.
There is a question which has just come in, and is by Elena Cercari or Kerkari, sorry. And she says, can really a form be separated from meaning? They come together, right? A form is an expression of meaning. And the question is for Kobus.
Yes, you're right. Form is an expression of meaning, but it's more complex than this. So I wrote to Terence Deacon exactly with this question. I asked him, you know, typically in postmodernist translation studies, we would say form and meaning can't be separated, etc., etc. And then he gave me a biological example, which I cannot repeat in detail here because my understanding of genetics and genes is too limited. But in biology, they can show how a particular feature of a gene can be translated from one plant into another plant and have the same, let's say, protecting against rust effect on another plant. So what has been translated? It's not matter that was translated. Somehow, form can only be expressed in a material, in matter. That is true. But I think we might want to rethink the possibility that we can distinguish between form and matter. It's not as if they're woven together, but they're not inseparable, if I can put it that way. Because from biology to these artworks, we see how something, and I'm not sure what we should call it, gets translated, gets remade. There's something left and something new, but it's recognizable as a similar kind of or pattern. We need to think more. And that also goes to Siri's question about what is translation. I think I'm quite clear on what I mean by what is translation. It is the work that is performed on semiotic material. But what does that work do? What is the nature of semiotic material? I don't know.
So I think that the final comment by Siri is the right one to close our Q&A session. So Siri says, what Nathan has done and what Kobus is describing and interpreting makes me so happy. Translation has infinite sources and targets and can occur among different semiotic systems. Very often we are blocked by Jacobson's definition of intersemiotic translation in that he privileged natural language, mainly written texts, Umberto Eco goes even farther, not accepting what we call the translation between semiotic systems as translation. So maybe it's important, though, that we define what we mean by, inverted commas, translation. Maybe ad hoc definitions, not pretending something final. What do you think?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. I think you can, at this point, we can describe it up to a point, but I think our knowledge, firstly, of cognitive process is still too limited, and our knowledge of the mapping of different materialities onto one another is still too limited. So I still don't know exactly what are we translating.
Thank you. Our question and answers session has finished, so I think that we are waiting for Siri to come back with us and to Salvatore for Salvatore to officially sort of close the conversation and come back.
Not so much. I would like not so much to close as to hand over to Siri, who probably has an epilogue for today's session. Okay, so Siri, over to you.
The epilogue is thank you. I am so grateful for this conversation and also the former one. I am delighted for how this colloquium is going. It's much more than I hoped for. A special thank to Nathan for this wonderful project. I will explore it in all details, and it will maybe take me a year, but I will do it because it's so just fantastic. So thank you for being here, and thank you for illustrating it, and thank you so much for to Kobus and Carolyn for how you have analyzed and seen all the translation aspects. I have so many notes. I would have had 10 more questions or comments, but I think we take it in another moment. I will just remind all of you that we are not finishing. We are finishing for today, but not for the colloquium. We are continuing tomorrow. We have 3 conversations, so it's a full day, but we start at the same time. My local time is 3. I don't know about you. Please figure out. And it will work in more or less in the same way. We will have a chair, we will have conversations, and we will have questions. And at the end, we will have a plenary discussion where hopefully many of the panelists are participating, and we will have a dialogue. And of course, things that we have taken notes of during the conversation, we can share them together. So we conclude the day, and thank you all so much. And of course to Salvatore and Giuliano also for guiding us through it with questions and introductions, etc. Thank you so much, everybody. See you tomorrow.
See you all tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.